One last issue that we'll cover is the constitutionality of sentencing juveniles to life without parole. We've had several U.S. Supreme Court decisions recently that have tried to determine whether it's constitutional or not, or is it cruel and unusual to sentence a juvenile to life without parole. Now, in order to be sentenced to life without parole, which means that the juvenile will serve a life sentence and have no opportunity to get out. There won't be any mercy, there won't be any parole, early release. They will serve the rest of their life in prison. And in order to get such a sentence, obviously the juvenile has to be tried as a criminal, as an adult. And so if they're put through the criminal system, or the adult system as we popularly call it, then they can be given a life sentence, uh, life without parole even. However, the Supreme Court has placed restrictions on this recently. For instance, the U.S. Supreme Court decided just a few years ago that it is unconstitutional, it is cruel and unusual to sentence a juvenile to life without parole for a non-homicide offense. So that means if the juvenile did not commit a murder, the juvenile cannot be sentenced to life without parole. So only juveniles who commit murder can be sentenced to life without parole. Remember from our previous discussions that the Supreme Court declared the death penalty unconstitutional for juveniles. So the juvenile cannot be sentenced to death in the United States. And again, we look at their age at the time they committed the offense, not when they're being tried. So if they were a juvenile when they committed the offense, they cannot be executed. Well, if the offense is not a murder, they can't be sentenced to life without parole. So if it's rape, no life without parole. If it's murder, life without parole might be possible. So that was one of the first decisions that the Supreme Court ruled recently, that handed down recently. After that decision, the Supreme Court was asked to determine if mandatory juvenile life without parole sentences was constitutional or were constitutional. So what happened is in some of those states that might have provided for the death penalty for juveniles, when the death penalty was struck down, some of them rewrote their laws. Sometimes the laws were already on the books, but in some instances, a juvenile who committed murder would receive a mandatory life without parole sentence. And so the Supreme Court had to determine, were such sentences constitutional? And the Supreme Court said no. Mandatory life without parole sentences for juveniles are cruel and unusual, and therefore unconstitutional. We must have individualized consideration of each juvenile's case. Without that individual consideration, a life without parole sentence is not permissible. So as it stands right now, there are juveniles who can serve life without parole sentences. And who can serve these sentences? Juveniles who commit murder and who have had an individualized consideration of their case. So the judge has taken a look at the circumstances around this juvenile and this particular crime and has sentenced this juvenile to life without parole. That is still permissible. The Supreme Court has not overturned all life without parole sentences. So it is possible in the United States for a juvenile to receive a life without parole sentence. But that juvenile has to have committed murder, and their case must be considered on an individual basis. And under those circumstances, as it is now, a juvenile could be sentenced to life without parole. Under all other circumstances, life without parole is not possible. Now, this has nothing to do then, at least right now, maybe it could lead to cases, but these decisions do not affect life with parole. So juveniles who receive life sentences, but there's the possibility for parole for early release, these cases are not governed, or these sentences are not governed by these cases. So maybe the Supreme Court will rule on life sentences, period. Even with parole, can we sentence a juvenile to life? That's something that may be considered in the next decade or so. But as it stands right now, the Supreme Court has not considered life with parole sentences. They've only been considering life without parole. And as we said, They've limited it to juveniles who commit murders and who have their individual case considered by the judge. So there are no mandatory life without parole sentences. Pennsylvania, at least until a recent decision that probably will force Pennsylvania to resentence some juveniles. Pennsylvania was leading the country in life without parole sentences for juveniles up until a recent Supreme Court decision. We're not going to get into particulars of that decision, but Pennsylvania had over 400 juveniles serving life without parole sentences. Again, many of those sentences, because of a recent U.S. Supreme Court decision, will probably be commuted to life with parole or maybe a term of years instead of life without parole. But we were the country's leader in the number of juveniles serving life without parole at one time.